Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Stewardship Team's presentation on generosity across generations. This has been an ongoing topic for our Stewardship Team for many years, actually, as we have been working specifically with the Generosity Project, and that's one of the tenets of the Generosity Project curriculum is actually cross-generational stewardship and generosity building. And so it was very exciting for us to be able to come up specifically with this generation that talks very specifically about how different generations respond to generosity and how you can effectively reach your own. So I am, again, Pastor Miguel Gomez Acosta, the Director for Evangelical Mission here in the Grand Canyon Synod. And with me today also is the stewardship team, including our chair, Janice Richard, who is also a council member. And as well as Dwayne Gilson from Spirit of Hope, and Linda Stotts, who is the director for the Generosity Project, but also is a member of one of our local congregations here. And she also used to be Senate staff years ago here in the Senate. So it is great to be with you here this evening. And I see you've been introducing yourselves in the chat. So thank you so much for that information. And I hope that we have a great presentation that's worthwhile for you this evening. So with that, I'd like to open up with prayer. So let us pray. Good and gracious God, you call us to celebrate all generosity, and you invite us to invite others into generosity. As we have this conversation this evening, Lord, may you open our minds so that we might be able to consider some possibilities. What are the possibilities for us to be able to reach others in different generations as we continue to have a discussion on what does it mean to be generous and how to engage others. So we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. With that, I'd like to invite Janice to go ahead and go.
Yeah, can we look at the previous slide, Linda? Thank you. Yes, I'm Janice Richard. Thank you for joining very much. And as Pastor Miguel said, our stewardship team has been for at least 3 years that I can count, been focused on this generosity project concepts. We've used the concepts and resources in 2 different grant applications that we have received to help support the expenses of workshops and travel, etc. So we're very excited to bring tonight yet another use of these concepts in studying the generations with you tonight. I think of the Generosity Project as a set of program resources that enable congregations and other groups to use for intergenerational experiential learning about God's generosity to us and our Christian response to God's generosity. And we are particularly honored in the Grand Canyon Synod to have Linda Stotts on our team. So thank you, Linda, for your leadership over the years, developing leading the project and enabling it in the Grand Canyon Synod. Our goal tonight is to encourage inclusion of all ages and generations, and we do that tonight in part by learning about them, by considering and raising our awareness of the uniqueness of the different generations, and we leave equipped with tools that will enable us to apply some of these concepts. So tonight, the 4 of us have split up the 7 generations into these 4 groups, and each of us will be speaking about what makes up those groups and their experiences. And we will conclude with questions. You'll have opportunities to give some of your observations and before we close. All right, so on to the goals. The Generosity Project fundamental precept and really all of our stewardship is that all that we have and all that we are comes from
You
God.
can turn Ozark on. I'll kind of watch it.
All right. Let me encourage you to mute everybody. Sort of forgot that part. All right, thank you. So we work tonight to understand how God has gifted individuals in each generation in unique ways and in common ways. We're going to consider what life experiences shaped the people of different generations and forms their values and their giving practices. Before we are done, we will be talking about the tools and resources that will be available to you in a separate document. And the goal of those resources are to enable you to include every generation in giving and sharing and serving as God's stewards. And in all of it, we celebrate those blessings that come full circle in the church and in the world. So next, Dwayne will tell us about the Generosity Project guiding principles.
Thank you, Janice. The guiding principles of the generational project is basically that generosity is essential as a daily practice in one's faith. Generosity should be part of your everyday. I mean, God preached generosity, be generous to all, take care of all. As Christians, our daily financial decisions are shaped by God's story in Jesus, and your story, my story, and the world's story. And the story is important. Jesus' story is important. Your church's story is important. Your personal story is important. People like a good story. They like to hear about what their generosity does to help others. They want to be part of helping others. So that's where your story becomes very important, and letting people know your story. Despite the generation, that's one common thing throughout all the generations, that everybody wants to know that their money is going to something good. All ages and generations are stewards of God's abundance, grace, and generosity. From the top to the bottom, we found through all of them, all of the generations, that if you're a good steward, and as generations move forward, it has stayed the same. Everybody wants to be a good steward of what God has given us. So that's a very important part of this project.
We call this the faces of generosity. So when you look at this compilation of people's faces, what do you see? Present are various ethnicities represented, but as well as ages and generations. As you look closely, you'll see elders, you'll see middle-aged individuals, youth, a child, and even a baby. One may give using a check or cash in an offering plate. Another shares by using a credit card or pledges with electronic giving from a bank account. Another only contributes if they're wearing their Apple Watch and using iPay, or a text to give is an option. Another individual, possibly in this group, only supports Kickstarter campaigns and Facebook requests from her friends, charitable causes, or birthdays. And for the baby, checks and actual coins or paper currency may not even exist by the time she's a teenager. When you visualize the faces in your congregation, who and what generations come to mind? What is the primary generation represented in your faith community? Who is absent? What is the primary generation in your neighborhood? Do you have participants in the life of your congregation who are parents, their grandparents, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, nieces, and nephews who they have relationships with? When you think stewardship, what generations and extended households do you reach and engage inside and outside the walls and campus of your church and congregation? What are your stewardship challenges and celebrations? What are your generational challenges and celebrations? This chart shows the 7 generations that we talk about and that the Generosity Project is based on. Many times in our society, they'll refer to 4 or 5, but there literally are 7 generations in our society. My own family includes 6 of the 7. My mother is 103, going on 104, who is still to this day very generous and tells wonderful generosity stories. My spouse is 82. I'm 74, a boomer. My 2 sons are Gen Xers. And then we have an extended family that we've adopted in Kenya. The 2 young adults are millennial. We don't have any Generation Z, but the 2 babies are part of that alpha generation. Each generation has gifts to share, stories to tell, knowledge and life experience to share. How can you bring them together to share and to learn from one another? Each generation also has needs that we can meet. Each generation's values, financial practices, and how they share and serve has been shaped by the world events around them and their own family's financial practice, status, culture, church, and life experience. When you plan your stewardship and discipleship ministries, think generations. How do we learn? Ask, how do we learn from one another? How do we include and engage and serve all generations, starting with our children? This youngest and most upcoming generation, those that are 9 and younger, are called the Alpha generation. When I think of this generation, what comes to mind is the story, the biblical story of the loaves and fishes as it's shared with us in John. It's a little boy that shares his lunch. And what does Jesus do with that? Jesus takes that small boy's gift and literally feeds thousands. It's a little boy who offers this gift in the midst of the doubting adults, the disciples. My spouse grew up watching his father every Friday come home with his week's pay in cash, going to the bedroom dresser, pulling out a small box that his father had made in Boy Scouts when he was young, and putting 10% of his pay into it. Then his father would walk into the kitchen and give his mother grocery money. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, hearing my parents sit around the kitchen table every fall, discussing the year's crops, sometimes there were tears, and the related expenses and income as they wrote their semi-annual check to the church, which I then witnessed them putting into the harvest basket that sat on the altar at Thanksgiving. What are your experiences growing up related to money? Was there enough to meet daily needs? What was your family's status in the community? Financial stressors? What did you learn about sharing, saving, and spending? What do you wish had been different? What role or influence, if any, did your community of faith have in your household's financial decisions and practices? What's impacted your current understanding of stewardship and practices? And if you grew up in a faith community, were you included in the congregation's stewardship ministry as a child? These are questions that I'm asking you, but you could also bring people together virtually on Zoom or in person to talk about. I can guarantee you that children are learning about money. We know that they're as young as 2, that they can name some of the commercials and the icons and people that these funny characters that represent brands. But what are these sources that they're learning from? Research informs us that very little financial conversation or education takes place in the home. And yet that is where we learn most of our knowledge about finances. We live in a consumer culture. Our children and families are bombarded 24/7 with media, advertising, and influencers. Everywhere we walk, drive, look, on the bus, and everything we touch on our digital devices and our virtual connections. How do we break this silence around talking about money? Specifically, what are the stories you and your congregation's households have to share? When and where could you provide in-person or virtual safe space to engage in these important conversations across generations, both on your campus and off? A challenge today is that we live in a digital giving age, and that changes everything. Children may not even see their parents giving, as it's online, it's electronic, or it's by credit card. This is why, especially for children and youth, an overall financial education approach organized by the congregation is vital today. A plan to teach entire households and to learn and encourage one another. We often talk about having stewardship that's an all year round approach. That's the same with this. Think about financial literacy and education as a year-round ministry. The congregation can take on this pivotal role to equip and encourage intentional conversations regarding time, talent, and treasure. In the resource list that you'll receive are links to financial literacy by age and stage of life, beginning with toddlers. Excuse me. We do not know yet how the worldwide historic event of COVID will affect the Alpha generation and their financial practices. We do know that including this generation in more than a noisy offering is critical. Include them in your communications, but primarily include them in your service opportunities. Provide opportunities for children and youth to share their gifts and to serve alongside people of other generations and ages. This is what happens. It builds authentic, lasting, caring relationships where stories are shared. It makes a difference. They know that they make a difference in the world as followers of Jesus. This is one example of a resource that's part of the Generosity Project. This is a take-home resource or a small group resource, or you could use it at your council meetings, leadership teams, but it's basically a two-sided sheet. There's 6 for 6 weeks with a biblical story, a blessing, questions, and an activity for people to do. And this is for 2 to 102 or 103, including my mother. I want to spend a few minutes talking about youth and young adults. With Sage Group, I think of the story of David and King Saul that's told in Samuel. David goes off to fight Goliath, and of course Saul wants to protect him and give him all the gifts that he has, and so he gives him all this armor that weighs David down, and David takes it off and says, God's given me everything that I need. For me, this is a lesson of how when we look at generations, especially our younger generations, God is already present. They have a gift, and they have a gift to share. This generation is on the way to becoming the largest generation, surpassing us boomers. They have never known a world without smartphones and the World Wide Web. Their lives have been shaped by COVID, school shootings, and gender equality. They are the most ethnically diverse generation and most globally connected. Often it is this generation that congregations will say is missing within their own walls. The challenge is go where they are and listen and learn, including conversations beginning with our own children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or the neighbors. Ask what it is they're passionate about. What are their concerns? What influences? Who are their influencers? That's a big word today around sharing, spending, saving. Who do they consider a friend or their community? Where do they find friends? Where do they find meaning in life? What do they know about your church? What do they think about God and Jesus? Know this: if you do not have a cool, up-to-date website or online presence, you've already lost this generation. They want transparency, authenticity, and nimbleness. They prefer mobile giving using their phones. They will give to an online cause through platforms such as GoFundMe, Kickstarter, and others. I just now recently talked to some members of a congregation that for a special project, they were doing a Kickstarter as part of their congregation's ministry. This generation want to be part of the solution. I think, again, financial literacy is important and part of the outreach to those that you already know in your congregation and into the neighborhood. For all of us today, there's much at stake in our changing world. How do our youth help us vision for the future and lead us in our work and in our ministry? God's already present among them. So how do we accompany them? How do we learn from them? How do we support them? How do we walk alongside one another as we learn to share our time, talent, and treasure?
So we're now going to continue to our next two generations, the millennials and the Gen Xers. We're going to start off with millennials. Millennials have the tendency, for the most part, to have been predominantly parented by uncritical and protective parents, which actually they were trying to set an example for work-life family balance. And so, which is one of the reasons why, for many people think, well, millennials are really confident. That's because they had parents that were always there, almost always there, and they were protecting them almost, I mean, a lot, and they were constantly trying to support them and encouraging them. And so that's one of those things that I know that many other generations have complaints about millennials, that they're a little too confident, but that it's just one of the things that happened. They primarily receive information through the internet versus television or radio. So that's not necessarily where they get their information, which also allows them to have the world at their fingertips. So since they had the internet, they were able to look up and have all kinds of information all right there, all in it's something that can fit in their pocket. Core values include diversity, again, work-life balance, equality, self-fulfillment, and eco-justice. Many of these millennials are really passionate about global warming and other ecological issues around the world. And so they tend to put a lot of effort into those kinds of activities, such as, for instance, if you were to do a God's Work Our Hands event where you actually went to clean out a beach or something of that nature, you probably have many millennials that will want to participate in such an event so as part of the ministry of the church. They have actually lived through 9/11. They were young kids, probably in kindergarten or even in elementary school when 9/11 happened. And so they have known only a time of war, because after that, Operation Enduring Freedom, then immediately after that, the hunt for bin Laden. And of course, they also survived the Columbine shootings, the start of school shootings, which started somewhere around Columbine. That was one of the first major ones, even though in urban places we've always have had school shootings, but not at the same rate as when these mass shootings in these other schools. They also were already able to experience the rise of social media. So they started going at it as soon as it came out, and they were very active in that. They also have experienced overbooked social calendars. So if you have had any kids before, remember that when my kids were little, we had to pretty much, we had dance and then soccer and then various different activities all throughout. It was all planned. It was all on the calendar. That was all part of that process. But they definitely experienced that. And of course, that they saw the birth of the Google search engine, which right there, again, information right at their hand, at their fingertips. And so it was always there. 60% of them, the millennials, actually have, the study shows that they actually give, and they give an average of $481 a year. That's usually to 3 different types of nonprofits. And so that most millennials have that 60% that give that 3 nonprofits that they support. Right now, they are the largest workforce on the market, but they are financially struggling. And so that has been an issue. And this is one of the reasons why they have not gone up in their generosity, but they have the potential to be major givers between 20 and 25 years. So as you make your own plans for your own congregation, or how you're going to not only teach generosity, but also how you're going to reach and do your appeals and all those things in your congregation, consider that millennials are going to be the ones who are going to be the biggest givers in your congregation in 20 to 25 years. They're socially conscious and support meaningful causes, especially through volunteerism and advocacy. How many remember the summer of 2020 with Black Lives Matter? That was one of the major things that millennials were definitely involved with, and anything that has to do with justice, they're all on it, and they're very excited about those kinds of things. Again, it's similar to the other group. Social media and texting are the way that they are supporting ministries. So again, the fundraising through Facebook or any other where you kind of announce your cause and they contribute to that, but also texting. So if your congregation doesn't have either social media stuff and or texting capabilities, I would highly encourage you to begin to look at that, because otherwise you're not going to be able to even have this group access this group to be able to, for them to give you the funding that you need, because that's usually the way that they support their causes is through texting and social media and online platforms versus the actual check writing or cash. So keep those in consideration. Next. Now to my favorite generation, and the only reason I say my favorite is because I'm a Gen Xer. And as a Gen Xer, I was preparing for this. A lot of things came to mind because I said, "Oh my gosh, this is so true," in the way that that this was framed. So our core values as Gen Xers, predominantly, there's not includes, but not limited to, diversity, self-resilience, practicality, informality, flexibility, and technology. So we're one of the ones that for two Gen Xers, they say that we're skeptical about everything, and we just don't care about anything. Well, there was an issue. There's a reason for that, and that's because for the most part, we were latch kids, and so we raised ourselves. And not only that, but we also had the highest divorce rate in history. So the peak of divorce rate in the United States was actually somewhere between the 60s and 70s. And so, for instance, I know a lot of my friends that in my generation that we have divorced parents. Not saying that every parent divorced, but that's just the reality of how we lived that out. So we have to kind of raise ourselves. Just a little example of kind of raising yourselves. I remember I was living in the Bay Area when the earthquake of '89 hit the Bay Area. And I was at the house by myself. As a latch kid, I was just there by myself. The earthquake happened. There was a big crack on the wall. I remember that. But I was alone by myself for the next 5 hours because my parents were at work and they were stuck in traffic. And so I just kind of made it work. I made myself dinner when there was no light or gas because our neighbor came over and turned off the gas. And so I had to make it work. So cereal was, and that's what we needed to do. So it is what it is, and we did it. But with that also, we lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we remember a time when there was communism, and then there wasn't communism. So then thinking about that, and then we remember the Challenger explosion. Actually, I remember very clearly because I was in a third grade. And as I was coming home, I'd done a little project where I actually built a Challenger made out of paper in school, and I came home crying because it exploded, and we were watching it live on the school TV. So that was very interesting. We also were experienced the start of America's war on drugs. Do you remember the Just Say No by the Reagan administration? And of course, all that meant, including the mass stuff that was happening in South America and all those things that were happening during the 80s. And of course, we were most of us were not eligible to fight in the Gulf War, but we had parents that actually went to the Gulf War or such. So, and we did see the rise of the PC, the personal computer, and the cell phone. And so that's where we actually share some experience with the millennials, is that we actually saw these things coming to fruition. And so we were able to benefit from that. We tend to be a little, just 1% less generous than the millennials, according to the study that we saw. 59% of millennials tend to give, but we do give more, and we give $782 a year on average. And we usually try to keep those dollars around 4 different nonprofits, which include actually religious organization. The millennials, when they were looking at their particular, like the types of organizations that support religious groups, were not a large part. They're mostly causes, again, for Save the Animals or those kinds of things. And so that's a different kind of trend. Again, we tend to be very skeptical about things, and so therefore we will not give to organizations that have bad testimonials. So transparency it's important for doing outreach to Generation X, and especially transparency where we know where each dollar is going, and we know exactly that there's a there is no record of there being anything necessarily gone array. So it's going to be very important that you keep, even in places like oh my gosh, Google, or when you go look up your congregation on Google Maps, there are references there, and they will tell you, you give a rating to your church. Make sure that you keep follow up on those, because sometimes people don't, and they don't realize that they actually have been getting negative reviews. And so that's something for you to consider. And so if you're wondering why you might not get to have Gen Xers coming, check that out and make sure that your reviews are actually correct. And also another thing that turns us off is outdated websites. Here's the reality: if your website is 2 years old, meaning it has not changed, and we're still getting ready to celebrate Reformation Sunday in 2020, there's a problem, because we want to make sure that everything is updated. And why give to, and that kind of demonstrates that when the website is out of date, that demonstrates that that there is no activity happening in congregation, at least that's the perception, and or that it's a sinking ship. So who wants to give to a sinking ship, right? And so make sure you keep those things in mind, to always have your social media and website up to date, so that people, especially in Gen Xers, can feel good about your congregation. We are more likely to give to organizations with active social media, again, and online giving. Myself, my family and I, we used to do the check a long time ago, and we stopped doing that. Now we do text giving. And so that's how we give to the organizations, well, not only our church, but the organizations that we support. We do that through that. And we are very likely to volunteer. So if given the opportunity to do so. And we're very likely to respond to peer-to-peer fundraising like Facebook during your birthday. Because again, if I tell my friends about an organization, there's a trust there already, because I'm vouching for this particular organization. So there's already a trust that's built in there. So consider that possibility, like having your even your membership do a fundraiser specifically if there's something specific to fundraise for, and then have them share so that maybe others can participate in that particular giving. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne.
Hi, Dwayne and I get to do the boomers with not quite the greatest generation, but one behind, right? Boomers are now 58 to 76. I'm on the very tail end of the boomers. I'm at 59. 4 out of the last 5 presidents have been boomers. President Biden is not a boomer. He was actually the mature generation. The boomers were born after World War II, and a lot of the early boomers, their parents were military. They maybe served in the war or participated in functions of the war, either working for Boeing building aircraft, but they probably had a military related job as a parent. They created and adapted some of the greatest scientific and technological discoveries. You think about Apple, most of that was discovered, built, engineered by boomers. They were some of the first people to receive the polio vaccine back in 1955. Before that, there was no treatment for polio. We don't know, the new generations don't understand living in an iron lung for years and years, and maybe sometimes for the rest of your life. They grew up during the Korean War. Some of them may have served in the Vietnam War, but the later boomers, the Vietnam War was over. And Vietnam War ended when I was still in grade school. They were in their 20s when the 60s Cultural Revolution occurred. In their 20s and 30s, they witnessed some of the worst race riots across our country. The generation, the mid-generation, or the later boomers, has been sometimes referred to as the Jones generation, as in keeping up with the Joneses. I feel I fall into that quite a bit. Growing up, it was we were trying to keep up with the Joneses. We hadn't really dealt with the Vietnam War. We hadn't seen a war in many years. So we had a completely different background than some of the early boomers. The baby boomers in the 50s, credit cards started coming out and became more common in the 50s and 60s. So anybody could get a credit card at that point. And the use of the credit card drove up a large financial boom as people were able to buy more items on credit instead of waiting to pay cash. Boomers are still your largest group of donors. It's coming up on the next page. Boomers are the largest generation, and they will be for another 7 to 10 years. The Generation X despite being the smallest generation at this time, will be one of the larger generations once the boomers are no longer at the top. Don't look past boomers when you're planning your stewardship campaigns. You want to make sure that you're actively catering to the boomers. Later boomers are adapting technology. They're more likely to give, maybe not by texting, but they're willing to do like electronic fund transfer, EFT every month or whatever out of their checking account. They're going to still drop that check, maybe drop the money in the offering plate occasionally, but you're not going to see them donating on Facebook or supporting causes unless they are direct, maybe a family or somebody like that that is trying to raise money. One story I have going back to what Linda mentioned earlier about the noisy offering. I remember noisy offerings in church where they pass the plate around and the kids, throw their change in there. I was ushering at a church one time, and there was a baptism going on, and there was an older gentleman, probably a generation, probably a boomer, and he was on the end, and he passed the offering plate to me, and he dropped in a bill, and then he took the plate back from me and he pulled out 2 bills. I thought, well, you can't make change in the offering plate. I kind of looked at him, and he took 2 bills back out of the plate and handed them to his grandkids. And then he took the plate and gave it to his grandkids so they could put that money in. Now that's demonstrating, to the next generation and the next generation that you need to be generous, that you're giving, that when grandpa finds this important that he donates money to the church. So, the most common saying is more is caught than taught. And they're definitely going to see that. You could tell them to be generous to church, but when they see you actually doing it, that makes a difference. Linda, you could do the next slide. This kind of shows, kind of wrapping up everything we've talked about as far as Generation Z through the boomers. You can see that the matures and the boomers are about 52%. They still like to donate money to causes. Once you get to the next 3 generations, it starts to change. You start to see the money part of it go down, actually quite a bit. And you start to see the volunteerism take a bigger and bigger part of it. You also start to see the peer-to-peer, which is the light gray on the right, start to pick up more and more. The WOM is word of mouth. And that might be somebody post on Facebook that their friend was in a car accident and needs money. And you donate directly to that person. They're not going through, any of the fundraising groups or people start a page or something like that. This is just basically direct to work. I hear about something, so I donated to it. And you can see that starting to grow a little bit. So, how do boomers compare to other generations and how they practice generosity? Over half still donate financially to the cause that they support. So 52% of what they donate is money. 19% is volunteerism. 8% is the word of mouth, which is generally like a family member that needs money. Advocacy is donating to groups or whatever, whether it's voting rights, you can pick any one of the number of political groups or non-political groups, peer-to-peer, and then 17% is other types of donations. Gen X and later are donating using peer-to-peer and volunteering, and then the increase in volunteerism in the next generation. Plan on how to create a story to bridge the gap from the monetary donations to volunteerism and outreach. You need to create that story that you're not just donating cash to a building. You're not just donating to, your church. You're donating to a cause. You're donating to a story. The story is that this church goes out and goes into the community and, serves breakfast. You want to, as Pastor Miguel said, if you want to get a Generation X excited or a millennial excited, ask them if they want to volunteer to serve food down at Grace Lutheran Church in the Valley or some church at a food pantry. Ask them to participate in that. They're more likely to do that than they are to, help on some project that you have going around. And the other thing is they need to see that the church is reaching outside of its doors. That it's not just everybody inside the church is going there on Sundays and walking out, and you're never seeing anybody else. And you need to be out in the community, and you need to let that story be known. And the best ways to do that are an active social media and an active web page. Get your pictures out there, get your stories out there, and get your events out there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dwayne. I'm going to talk about the last generational group, which we've combined two generational groups, the silent generation and the greatest generation. Um, they're ages 77 to over 100 at this point, and most of this group, combined group, is the silent generation. As church leaders, you may know well this generation as it's participated in the church well. But the danger is that sometimes they're taken for granted. So we'll work to understand a little better the church members in this mature generation have really seen it all. They were born in the early 1900s. They were children during the lean years of sacrifice of the Great Depression and the World War II. They sacrificed not just their livelihood, but sometimes their lives of family members. Adults of the matures were experienced the Cold War, the emotional years of the McCarthy era, and the other wars and the civil rights movement, and they began rock and roll. So we got a lot of experience there, but you add to that all the historical events since. Your members of the mature generation have seen it all. They lived through 9/11, and while they were not children, it affected us all. The dot-com explosion and the pandemic perhaps affected this generation as much or more than others. So it's mind-boggling and it's humbling to me to think of all that they've experienced, and all those experiences shaped their values. They're raised to respect authority, to be seen and not heard, and the McCarthy era as adults also encouraged them that sometimes it's best to stay quiet. They have a strong work ethic and demonstrated willpower. They've really been important contributors to projects in the church. They're loyal to employers and they've been loyal to the church. They're civic minded. They're concerned with justice and inclusion. And they've had to learn along those lines to change. Throughout their lives, they've seen ideas change and values change, and they've been part of that themselves. Mature generation is thrifty because of living through those lean years. They want to get their money's worth. I'm a daughter of parents of the greatest generation. And when I got married and got a degree, I moved 1,000 miles from home. So I had some challenge in staying in contact, and I really wanted to. So we spoke by phone. Well, there weren't any cell phones, and there weren't any long distance included packages. So yeah, you were paying by the minute. And when I would call my parents and get into maybe the third minute of our conversation, my mom would break in with, well, this is costing you money. And that was pretty much the end of the conversation. So I still hear her voice. I don't say that, but I still hear that and appreciate all that those generations went through, that they learned that value of being thrifty. In addition to the factors into the values of the events, the stage of life also impacts our generations in our church today. And for matures, they are in a very steady phase of their financial situation. Whether their situation is good or it's bad, they pretty much know what it is. They don't live with the kind of uncertainty that working people do with respect to getting laid off in the changing economy. And at this stage in life, they are thinking about their personal responsibility and legacy. They have continuously in these recent years lost friends and family members. And so there's no more denying, that that they're mortal and that they are thinking about these things. And so I encourage all of our leaders of our churches to serve this generation well. They have served the church their entire lives. Do not overlook them, though it's tempting due to their silence. So what are the implications for our churches and for stewardship initiatives, our stewardship initiatives year-round and in the annual emphasis? This generation, still, the traditional means of communications are the way to reach them. Direct mail and phone calls, especially a phone call from someone in authority, like the pastor or a church leader. Tell them the stories of the impact of their gift. This generation deserves the personal touch, a personal invitation to participate, to be engaged in the way that they can. They can't do what they used to do, but they still have gifts to offer. And by all means, this personal touch needs to include a thank you. My church in the pandemic learned a lesson that is valuable and is being carried on, and that is that when we were not meeting, when we were not handing out newsletters in church, we were not in person, we began using email more and using digital for our newsletters. But to not leave out those who are not into email of this mature generation, we had a member who cared enough to print out those all congregation emails and mail them to the mature generation members of our church. They really appreciate that, and it really helps them stay in touch. So even if your stewardship initiative is not generally direct mail, consider a direct mail to this generation. They still give with checks in the mail or in the offering plate. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, that's the case. So offering plates remain of practical importance as well as a symbolic importance. Obviously, they're going to do more financial giving and less volunteering. We saw that in the chart that Dwayne had, that their charitable patterns are much like the boomers. But we can ask them to tell their stories of generosity. And that's what we do when we gather or in other means. In the resource list that you'll get, you'll see a reference to the Generosity Project webpage. The other resources includes the Northwest Synod of Wisconsin did a stewardship emphasis where they emphasized, they heard from each generation each week. And there are a video on there from the silent generation and one from the greatest generation. They really have important stories to share about generosity. And frankly, they're inspiring. So this generation is ready to talk about planned giving. I encourage you, not to ask your visitors to speak to Homebound about legacy giving, but make sure they're aware of it. Make sure it's on their minds and they have the resources or know that they can access legacy giving resources, because that may be a great gift that the church has to give them when you can do less and less and you're wondering what your life's about and what it's going to amount to in the end. This opportunity may come up with a conversation with a Homebound. So I recommend that you just at least make visitors aware of what's possible. And amongst our resources in the Grand Canyon Synod is an ELCA Foundation member, Lisa Higginbotham, who is available to work with your congregation on legacy giving or with individuals, both. So we have her access. Next, Miguel is going to take us to the next phase of this presentation.
Okay, so taking it home, we have heard a lot of information here. Don't worry, if you didn't catch something, you can probably kind of get it in the recording and also on the resource list that we're going to give you. But as you think about all that you've heard, especially hearing about the different generations and how each one serves out generosity differently, were there any aha moments for anybody that's here right now? You're welcome to unmute yourself and let us know what it is that if you had an aha moment or any observations or questions or ideas that you might have had during the presentation. Was there anything on the chat, Dwayne, regarding questions?
There was not. I see Karen Olson just unmuted herself.
Yes.
Yes,
Karen.
I'm sorry I don't have my video available, but one of the things that really stood out to me, our congregation is primarily the more mature generations, and we have had as a council and other leadership in the church have had so many discussions about younger that younger demographic and how do we go about reaching out to them in an effective way. And all of the discussion about the social media and the different ways that they prefer communicating and getting involved and volunteering really struck home to me. Yeah. Because I think we're missing that whole those opportunities. We have not been taking advantage of them. So I'm certainly going to take that back to the council.
Great.
We have our meeting, because that was really, really helpful and
Good.
enlightening.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if we don't have that expertise within our own walls, then it's inviting someone's grandchild or, children to come and be the experts, help us set up, how do we do text to give? How do we, update our website and all those kinds of things? That's where we need to bring in, even if they're, not within our walls, the people that can help us do that.
And Pastor Diane said that she learned more about younger generations. So did we. Because we went on to try to figure this out, this presentation, we definitely did our own research, and it's surprising to see to read about some of these trends, which is interesting because I think as congregations, oftentimes we're so used to doing things a certain way that we forget that there is other ways of doing things, and especially like we're wondering why is it that we're not having success on this way or in reaching more younger people or having young people participate in the generosity of the congregation. And so so one big example that recently that I experienced was actually I was at a congregation, St. Lydia's Table in Brooklyn, New York, 2018 actually, 2018. And as I was there, this is a young adult ministry, and I saw no offering plate. First of all, it's dinner church. So but there was no offering plate, but they did have an iPad that they passed around doing the offering, and that was how they collected their offering. So everybody was swiping their card on this iPad with the little box thingy. I forgot what they're called, but that's how that's how congregations that congregation responded specifically to their demographic.
It's one thing I noticed, and you might want to talk to your councils or to church or do it yourself, is a lot of time people have things set up. I know we have texting, you give text to give or whatever you want to call it set up, but if you ever look at the instructions on how to do it, it's very complicated. And if it is complicated, find an easier system. And if you haven't tried it, try to donate yourself once just by texting, just to see how hard it is and does it really work. We started out with the text to donate, and we had quite a few people texting, and then all of a sudden it just dried up and we couldn't figure out why. It turns out it wasn't working anymore. There was some bug that had happened on a release and it didn't work. And then also we have the donate now button on our website. Same thing, you just put it there, you assume it works. And then somebody let us know that it hadn't been working in over 2 months. You know, that they normally went in once a month and made a donation, and they couldn't do it for 2 months. And then they let us know. It's like for 2 months we were missing donations that way. So you need to put the things in place, but then monitor them to make sure that they're working.
Indeed. John, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just I heard in the presentation that about the mature group, they tend to be in stable financial situations, and they're either doing really well or somewhere on the scale. Any tips on how do you communicate your stewardship goals and needs when your audience, your target have a difference in abilities to give to the church? So you want to, I always want to be sensitive that some of the members are on fixed incomes and they're already giving the church a very generous gift in their circumstance, and other members, are able to just do a lot more. And you want to get the word out that you have a need, but you don't want to make people feel bad and so I know it's probably not the first time this has come up. So any tips on dealing with that?
You make a really good point, John, and that is that in some projects, people can be encouraged, that any gift is helpful, but their contribution may be prayer. I mean, that is the most powerful thing we can do as Christian givers, is to remember one another and remember the ministries in prayer. And so there are other ways that someone who does not have financial means can participate. Maybe they'll help with publicity. Maybe they'll help spread the word or make phone calls. So it is really important not to think of our gifts and our opportunities to give as only being financial, but there are jobs to do, and some of them can be done from home. We have at my church a food pantry, and one of the members is of the mature generation, and she can't come and work the food pantry, but she schedules. So she's the one that stays at home and calls and makes sure that we have a volunteer schedule. So there's all different kinds of things that people can do in addition to or besides giving money.
Yeah, and along with celebrating the different types of generosity, which includes volunteerism and prayer and all these things, which I highly do encourage, just because we need to make sure that those are celebrated. I also want to warn us not to remove somebody's capacity to make their own decision. And by that, I mean that, we make, when we look, because especially pastors, we kind of know, and if your congregant's financial situation, we feel bad about even making an ask, even the general ask, because we're like, well, they're going to feel bad about it. But the reality is that the Spirit moves where the Spirit moves, and we want to make sure that they are given the choice. Let me give you just a brief example of how when somebody judges your situation without asking, it can go really awry. So when my wife and I were young and happily married, I'm sorry, but when we first were married, we were broke. I mean, just like, because we were college students, right? We were broke. I was working full time, going to seminary part time. My wife was in school full time and working part time. And we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were just broke. The kind of broke where, if you found a $20 bill in the laundry, it was a celebration, because that meant that Friday night we were going to have pizza, beer, and a movie, right? And that was exciting. That was a good weekend for us. But that being said, she worked at the school that we were at, had a little preschool that was part of the education piece there too. And the preschool had staff, and there was a staff Christmas party. But what happened is that the location of the school was up on the hill, which in Issaquah, which unfortunately is also well-to-do, and so everybody was well-to-do. The people that were working there were generally well-to-do because their husbands were working for Microsoft and so on and so forth. Yeah, so my wife was a part-time student and worker was working there. So when there was a gift exchange, she walks into the party thing, but because she's a staff person and she doesn't realize that there's a gift exchange. She asks, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know there was a gift exchange." And then literally the director says, "Well, you know, we knew you were a poor college student, so we didn't ask you to bring anything, right?" When she came home crying because she was really devastated by that. I mean, she's like, and I'm like, oh my God, it's like, who is that woman to judge what if my wife wanted to participate? I would do anything to make sure that my wife would have participated. But that moment, she made a decision based on her judgment and removed her capacity to make that choice. So I encourage you that I know we don't want to chase them down and you know, wear them down like asking for donations specifically, but allowing everybody from the congregation to participate, $1, 50 cents, prayer, anything is all about participation. And we don't want to remove that capacity for somebody to make that decision for their behalf instead of us making it for them because we think that they don't have the means to do it. So that's my only warning about that, is just keep that in mind as you know, that, you know, give people their own capacity to make the decision because they're grown people. They can decide what they're going to decide. So anyway.
Miguel, I'll just add to that. My mother at 103, still able to write checks and sends out birthday, you know, envelopes to all her grandchildren. But the church stopped bringing her envelopes. And yet all these other charities continue to ask, and she writes checks to them. She has the capacity to give, but the church stopped asking.
Wow. I want to bring up one other thing that we had earlier with Janice today was one of the ideas that she put out, and I think it's a great idea, is if you have somebody in your church that does home visits, whether it's to give communion or just to go out and visit somebody, try printing out your bulletin or whatever you have, like whether it's an email or a pamphlet or you know, PDF, whatever it is, print it out in a larger print and take it with you when you go to visit those people and hand it to them. They probably don't have email or access to email other than on their phone. They're not going to be able to read the church bulletin on their phone. And she said that they started doing that. What a great idea. I mean, just to include those people. How else are they going to know if, you know, if they want to donate to something? They don't know what's going on in the church. They don't know what groups that, you know, something might be coming up. Maybe there's a spaghetti dinner coming up that they didn't know about, but they would gladly have donated to it. So I think it's a great idea to include them in any way possible that way. So.
Yes, Sue?
We were talking before about the text to giving and the different ways. And at church, we've gone back to passing the plate a bit, depending upon how many people are in the pews. And the discussion had come up about, you know, now it's often mostly empty because so many of us are electronically giving. And what message is that sending? That the plate moves back and forth and has very little in it.
Sue, this is Dwayne with Spirit of Hope. What we did for that same situation is we put little cards in the back of the chairs. And it basically says, I donate electronically, and they can take that card and drop it in the offering plate. So
yeah, we have those.
Yeah.
And
it does send a signal that I am donating, you know, not that, well, nobody else donated, why should I? So.
So Sue, as a member of Holy Trinity too, I would highly encourage that during the worship time, when you make that announcement that it's time for the offering, that you make clear that those cards are there. Because when I go to church, not that I go a whole lot because of my travels, but when I do make it to church, I didn't even know we had those cards. And so if I would have known, I would have gotten it, because we give once a month, we give our amount once a month. And so now that I know that there's a card, I'm gonna have to find one and throw it in the plate next time it comes around.
yeah, we thought about going back to just having the plates in the front and the back of the sanctuary too, you know, and not passing them. So it just, you know, we were concerned about what message because of it being
I agree.
mostly empty.
It is one of the reasons why we put the cards in, is because somebody brought up that same point. They said, well, I give electronically. I don't, there's two things. There's one, your own impression, right? That people, they see you not donating. But the other one is exactly your point, is that, well, nobody else donated. You know?
Right. And it's not, I mean, financially, we're doing fine. So it's not an issue. It's more of the perception.
Exactly.
Okay.
Perception is everything.
So we'll keep working on it. Thanks.
Thank you. David,
Well, one
welcome
thing
back,
I was-
by the way.
Hi there. Yeah, back from sabbatical just yesterday. Well, one of the things that we do is, I mean, one, we talk about it when we do pass the offering, talking about the fact that, you know, there's these electronic opportunities and stuff like that, so people are aware of it, and there's instructions in the bulletin. But the other thing we do is it might be an opportunity to expand your generosity in other ways. Through the Mission Leadership Academy, Beautiful Saviors started what was called Sunday Dollars. And that is something where every dollar bill, regardless of who throws it in there, ends up going to pay for these ministry programs, which then we have people come up and talk about these outreaches, these things with the schools, the large group foster care homes, whatever that may be. So it tells the story, but it also always provides something in the plate. And more importantly, we've discovered it helps those people who do the monthly check or the electronic whatever, that it keeps them engaged every time they're there.
Yeah.
And so it gives them the opportunity to show generosity. Yeah, even though it's a couple of dollar bills, there's an active participation that's
Indeed.
always there. So
Yeah.
that's one thing we've done. And you can find ways of supporting other ministries or whatever that way. If you want to talk more about it later, I won't take up this group's time, but we can chat.
Well, I remember when I was in my last parish, we actually had something called Change for Change. And it was exactly that, where you took change, and the children, we actually encouraged the kids to come up because it was usually just coins and stuff, and people would save their change. And once a month, this big old jug of water that would cut off just for the handles. People would come and dump out their change in there, so that it was really noisy change, right? But that was the opportunity for the children to participate and to, you know, so for them to see and recognize that money was being given. All right. Any other questions or comments before I turn it to Dwayne? If not, Dwayne,
Okay.
you're next.
All right, just to kind of recap, you know, we hope everybody's doing well with their stewardship. One of the things that we always need to do is we need to continue looking at and tweaking. As you can see from the different generations, as our church has changed, the needs and the needs for the generosity to continue will change. So what's working now may not work a year from now as your congregation changes, as you get more younger people in. How they donate is going to change, and you need to keep up with that. What did you learn about tonight? Was there any takeaways? Anything that you have more questions on? You can contact Pastor Miguel. There's information will be in the chat, and then when we send this out, you'll have all that information as well. You know, take a breath, sit back, review this thing when you get it. Think about everything that was talked about, and just, if there's a lot of resources at the end, there's a lot of links to web pages that we learned from. And I encourage you to use all of those and use what we have available to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne. I just want to talk, as we're ending here, just about some of the resources that you will be getting. We will be attaching, it'll be on the website, and if we have your email, we'll send it to you directly, but there will be a PDF. It's 5 pages long, and it will have these links. And again, we've learned as a team, and there's just incredible resources out there about generations and generation giving, both in faith communities and in the world today. I think my wish for you personally is just simply to develop a curiosity about generations, and form a team of multi-generations, and research and read. And when you look at these resources, and I just put this as an example, but on the second page, it actually, there's a resource on development. You know, we know about developmental ages and stages, but for financial literacy, what should a 3-year-old know? What should a 6-year-old know? So when my whole brain goes to, if I was planning an entire year around stewardship, around generosity, financial literacy, oh my gosh, the kinds of things that we could put on the website or we could hold for the community. But just around the idea of education. And really that's what the Generosity Project is about. It's about relationship, but it's about bringing generations together to ask that, well, what shaped you? What do you remember? You know, what's your value around money? But it's face to face, sharing those stories and those ahas. So we appreciate the differences. I remember my dad going off to church council meetings, and he would say, I sure hope that Stan's not there because he doesn't know the meaning of a dollar. And I know that Stan was south of town saying, I sure hope that Ray Cruz doesn't show up because he won't spend a penny. You know, often we come together and we have these different values that shape our conversations. So how do we build respect for one another? And again, just be curious and think about stewardship as also financial education and literacy for all ages. This is just a screen grab from the Generosity Project. You have the link, all the resources are on the Grand Canyon Synod website. It's an ELCA ministry. And as they said earlier, I had the privilege of being the coordinator for that for almost 8 years. But most of these are free. Some starting where you see the little dollars, see the little dollar sign there. I think it's $36 for this actual curriculum. But if you're interested, we can put you in touch with, we have extra copies we'd be glad to share. We're also willing to come and host a workshop, but it's also all downloadable from the website. And you could do a small group, have a church council, stewardship team, discipleship team meeting just on the foundation piece. You know, what is this about? And this is, to me, stewardship is as much about discipleship as it is about, it's discipleship, and stewardship is a faith practice. It comes out of being disciples. So don't, combine, don't think of it as like, oh, this is stewardship and this is discipleship. It's all one. And how do you even bring your own teams together if that's how you're divided in your congregation? But check it out, check out the website. So I think in closing that these are some of the principles around the Generosity Project, but also what have really been the foundation for our own work as the stewardship team in the Grand Canyon Synod, that being generous, what does that mean? It's a role and responsibility of being God's steward that we fulfill joyfully. Living generously is the giving of our whole selves as students who want to be like Jesus. And at its core, generosity is an exchange of resources, both giving and receiving, that bless and sustain community. Eric Law in California, this is a quote from him, and I love the way he approaches generosity, that it's a giving and receiving. So often we think of generosity as only giving, but it's also about receiving. And how do we receive graciously? And it's an exchange between all the ages and all the generations. And it's not always money, it's our time and our talent and so much else, our knowledge and life experience. So generosity is God's promise, it's Jesus' example, and it's our holy, holy practice. Thank you. I'm just so excited. We've actually grown now. We have 21. We started out with 15. So you must have been texting during this, inviting your friends to come. But as a blessing, and maybe if you would each just cup your hand in front of you and make the sign of the cross in the palm of your hand. And let's say together, you are the child of a generous God, or say it, I am the child of a generous God, growing in God's grace, generation to generation. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, everyone. A quick announcement I forgot to mention that Dwayne Gilson is also he does Financial Empowerment University. So he's eligible to do trainings for your congregation. So please let him know if you're interested in such a thing for your particular congregation. If there's no other questions, thank you so much for taking another extra 15 minutes from our allotted hour to be with us. So thank you and blessings. Have a good night.